Welcome, everyone. We are delighted to welcome you to part 2 of our 3-part sustainability series. Hopefully you listened to Megan Hudeshell's presentation on compliance needs around ESG on June 1st. If you didn't and you would like the recording, let us know and we can make it available to you. Today's session is the second part of the series titled Carbon Products, Know What You're Buying. And then the third program in the series called Greenwashing, Why This Should Keep You Up at Night with Teresa Bevilacqua and our very own Zev Simpser will be on June 22nd at 11 Central. So please join us for that also. My name is Rhona Schmidt. I'm a partner in the Minneapolis Corporate Group, and I am a technology licensing attorney by trade. I have been working with clean tech technologies for a couple of decades now and carbon products since 2020. Now, you might ask yourself, why would a tech licensing lawyer get involved in carbon products? Well, a tech licensing lawyer spends their day working with complex commercial contracts, dealing in intangible rights, intellectual property rights in that case. And carbon product contracts are also complex commercial contracts dealing with intangible rights. So that's how I got involved in this area. Over to you, Zev.
Yeah, and I'm Zev Simpser. I'm generally a utilities and energy lawyer, and there's a lot of parallels between carbon products, and carbon markets, as there are with renewable energy and renewable energy products and renewable energy markets that were nascent very much so when I was just starting my career. So this is just going back through what to do when there are no rules, but just with a different set of products. And with those parallels and the ability to read complex guidance, we started getting into the carbon markets as well.
Great. Let's start with a couple of housekeeping items. Please sign in on our attendance form. The materials in the attendance form are available for download from the reminder email that was sent from events@dorsey.com. Don't forget to return your completed attendance form to attendance@dorsey.com, and we will also put this information in the webinar chat for you. Dorsey is going to be applying for CLE in the jurisdictions that are listed on the invitation. And then finally, after today's program, we're going to send out a survey, and we'd appreciate your feedback on that, especially as we get ready for our next presentation in this series. Time permitting, we will take questions at the end of this presentation, and if we're making good time and you have questions in the chat, we might answer as we go as well. So what's our agenda? Well, our goal from this presentation is to help you understand ways to meet the E in ESG. E, of course, stands for the environmental pillar of governance, which covers climate change strategy, carbon footprint reductions, greenhouse gas emissions, and other such items. We're going to cover the standards, rules, and guidance that are the moving target in which we are working and assessing carbon products, the types of markets that you or your clients may be part of, the different emission scopes and what they mean and what taking action looks like for each of those scopes. And then we're going to walk through the vocabulary that you need to understand when transacting in carbon products, the differences between the carbon products and what to look out for, and how to go about purchasing them or selling them, depending on which market you're in. And finally, we're going to cover best practices and pitfalls to avoid in the carbon product area. Before we start, we thought it would be useful to go through some key terms that Zev and I are going to use repeatedly throughout the presentation so that you have an understanding of what we're talking about. The first one is GHGs, or greenhouse gases. And for purposes of the standards, which is the guidance that we're using today, and whenever we're talking about carbon products just now, there are 6 greenhouse gases. I can only actually pronounce 3 of them: carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane. But all 6 of these are the gases that are relevant. When we talk about emissions, we mean release of any of those greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So you typically think of a greenhouse gas being released when you burn wood on your bonfire in your backyard. But there's many, many activities that release greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, including the jet fuel on a plane, the gas in your car, burning the gas on your stove when you're cooking, the byproducts of various chemical processes within your client's plant, overtilling soil, deforestation, the application of nitrogen fertilizer to soil, and the gas produced by certain animals when they're digesting their food. All of those are emissions. Greenhouse gas removal is when the greenhouse gases are absorbed or stored from the atmosphere by a particular act or refraining from doing something that was causing an emission. So, for example, if you plant more trees, which capture more carbon dioxide, because when plants, trees included, breathe, they breathe up carbon dioxide as part of photosynthesis. When you do that, you're capturing carbon in the trees. And then if you don't cut down those trees or they don't burn down, you can retain the carbon, and that's greenhouse gas removal. Greenhouse gas reduction is when a company's inventory of emissions is reduced over time due to some action or refraining from doing some action. For example, at a personal level, you can reduce greenhouse gases by switching from a gas-driven lawnmower to a manual lawnmower, although that would not go over well in my house. Value chain is the term that we use to define all of the activities associated with the reporting company's operations up and downstream. So an example here, if you take a big retailer, big box retailer, their value chain starts with the raw materials that go into the products that get packaged and end up on their shelves, and ends with the disposal of the waste and the byproducts from the sale of the products. That all of those activities are in the value chain, but they're not all part of the retailer's own operations, owned or controlled operations. This is different from supply chain, which is all of the different organizations involved in the production, delivery, and sale of a product to a consumer. We're going to talk about value chain a lot today. And finally, we may mention carbon dioxide equivalent, CO2e. This is a unit of measurement that's used to indicate the global warming potential of greenhouse gases, expressed in terms of the global warming potential of 1 unit of carbon dioxide. And it's the unit that you use when you are quantifying carbon products. With that background, I will turn you over to Zav to help us understand the different standards, rules, and guidance.
Well, thanks, Rhona. One of the big things here is really to understand that outside of a few compliance markets, mainly in California, at least for US law, there are no real standards, rules, guidance, or law, and most importantly, binding legal obligations. Certainly, there's a lot of things that are coming through the SEC, and we'll talk about those a little bit. There are some regulations for reporting of major sources of greenhouse gas emissions, but that's generally as far as the law interpreted broadly will take you. The two big areas of potential regulation currently are the SEC's proposed rule for the enhancement and standardization of climate-related disclosures for investors. That was very much the subject of part 1 of this series. And importantly for this discussion, the Commodities Future Trading Commission, the CFTC, has sought comments for the potential to regulate the carbon market. And what they are concerned about is the integrity of carbon offsets, greenhouse gas emissions avoidance and reduction claims, and to enhance the integrity of the voluntary carbon markets and foster transparency, fairness, and liquidity in those markets. Those regulations would be applicable to much of what we're talking about today, but they don't yet exist. And it's unclear if the CFTC is going to act or not. So what does govern carbon products? Well, at the end of the day, it's a series of non-governmental organizations who have provided guidance. You hear a lot about the Science-Based Target Initiative and meeting science-based targets. Most of these obligations that are imposed on corporations are voluntary. They're looking to eliminate their greenhouse gas emissions or beat a certain threshold based on a baseline year or something like that. And so how we measure and understand what kind of carbon reductions have occurred throughout the value chain and for the different inventories and what guidance do we have to measure and then identify progress comes through these standards. One of the main standards that is forming around to be sort of the best practices to follow are the greenhouse gas protocols. There's some links in the slides here so that you can look at different kinds of protocols. The corporate standard is the one that we generally find to be the most direct, and then rolling off the corporate standard, there are sort of derivative works that provide additional guidance. The GSG protocol really provides the most comprehensive way to measure your carbon emissions as an organization, both your scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. They provide guidance for how to record, audit, and calculate those emissions, as well as ways to curb and reduce them, and also how different carbon products should work in this general sense. The other thing to recognize is these protocols are oftentimes instituted by carbon registries, and we'll talk about what a registry is and the products that are available on these registries. And the registries generally oversee the granular level of certain products that are then the carbon reductions or offsets that are produced by those projects are then set up on the registry. They're not the be all end all, but it's important to recognize that they play yet an additional role in oversight of these things. But again, they are all non-governmental. They are not recognized by any government as the legal standard, much like you would have certain registries in the renewable energy standard. There are three main ones: the VERA, the Climate Action Reserve, and the American Carbon Registry. So there is a compliance market that's really, like we talked about, but at the end of the day, the bulk of the issues that are most interesting to folks and most relevant are really in the voluntary markets. These markets really are ways that people are going to meet their sustainability goals. These are generally geared towards corporate sustainability goals and finding opportunities for corporations to go reduce their emissions, offset their emissions, or overall lower their scope 1, 2, and 3 carbon inventories.
So what are these emissions? Well, the corporate standard, as Zev mentioned, classified a company's emissions as direct or indirect. And this is back in 2001. It was revised in 2004. Direct emissions are the emissions from the sources that are owned or controlled by the reporting company. Indirect emissions are emissions that are a consequence of the activities of the reporting company, but they occur at a source owned or controlled by a different entity. So in my retailer example, the retailer's direct emissions are going to be the emissions from the sources that are the facilities or the trucks run by the retailer. And then the indirect emissions are going to be the emissions from everyone in the retailer's value chain, so the raw material suppliers' emissions, for example. The corporate standard then divided direct and indirect emissions into 3 different scopes, handily called scope 1, 2, and 3. And it required companies that were following the corporate standard to account for and report all scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, and then they were flexible as to whether they could report on scope 3 emissions. Since that point in time, there was a realization that, in fact, there were significant emissions occurring in the entire value chain, not just what was controlled by the reporting company. And so scope 3 standard came about, and the scope 3 emissions end up being the largest source of emissions for many companies because they have so many organizations that are in their value chain. And so this creates a significant opportunity for a reporting company when they look at their scope 3 emissions, because they can use them up and down the value chain to influence greenhouse gas reductions and removals. It gives them more to play with, basically, than scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. So the scope 3 standard was designed to create further consistency in scope 3 inventories through additional requirements and guidance for scope 3 accounting and reporting. And if anyone's going to look at the corporate standard and the scope 3 standard, they're a very quick read and have lots of pictures which help you work through the process. So what are all these scopes? Well, scope 1 emissions are the direct emissions from the operations owned or controlled by the reporting company. And there's basically 4 different types of activities that these fit into. The first is generation of electricity, heat, or steam resulting from combustion of fuel in stationary sources. So your own boilers, your own furnaces, your own turbines that you're using within your business. The second is physical or chemical processing if you're involved in that kind of industry. The third is the transportation of materials, products, waste, and employees. So here it's the combustion of fuels in the vehicles that are moving stuff around, stuff and people around. And the fourth is fugitive emissions. And these are emissions resulting from intentional or unintentional releases. So for example, if you have refrigeration units or air conditioning equipment, you will have HFC emissions from those different pieces of equipment. So a typical scope 1 example is emissions from a company's vehicles or facilities while running the operations of the company. And if you take a look at this picture, the middle, you'll see there's 4 different arrows. 2 of them relate to scope 3, 1 to scope 2, and 1 to scope 1. The one in the middle is the scope 1 that I just mentioned. And so it's the reporting company's owned or controlled facilities or vehicles that they have scope 1 emissions from. So back to this slide, scope 2 emissions, then they are a special category of indirect emissions that come from the generation of purchased or acquired electricity, steam, heat, or cooling that's consumed by the reporting company in their owned or controlled equipment or operations. So again, a pretty narrow category of emissions. You can see on the slide, they're off to the left-hand side here as the purchased electricity, steam, heating and cooling relating to the owned or controlled operations of the reporting company. All other indirect emissions, so everything that's not in scope 2, all other indirect emissions that occur in the value chain of a reporting company are scope 3 emissions. And this is what the scope 3 standard focused on, breaking them into 15 different categories. 8 of them are upstream and 7 of them are downstream from the reporting company. So upstream would be everything that feeds into the operations of the reporting company, and downstream is selling off the products, for example. And these 15 categories range from purchased goods and services through to investments. So you will see when we look at this slide and all the different scope 3 categories as compared to the scope 2 and scope 1 categories, how much more opportunity there is to understand your inventory, your greenhouse gas inventory, and make changes that impact the planet. So back to you, Zev, on how you do that.
Well, and I think this is where you start talking about carbon products and how this is all intended to work. One of the things that I think is just an important concept to put in front of people is to say that generally a scope 3 emission is a derivative of somebody's scope 1 emission somewhere else. So if there's a trucking company bringing goods to your loading dock, that trucking company's scope 1 emissions are your scope 3 emissions. And so that brings the whole world in essentially an organic contact with itself. And it's important to keep that in mind as you look at how are you going to mitigate your different inventories. So with scope 1, those are your direct emissions. Those are the things that you do, as Rhona said. And so how do you manage those? You reduce them. You find alternative ways to create your products. You find less greenhouse gas intensive ways to do those things. However, if in many industries, that may be impossible. And so one of the other ways to manage your scope 1, it's not reducing your scope 1, but is to manage your scope 1 is to say, it's inevitable that I'm going to produce greenhouse gases for X, Y, or Z process. Therefore, what I'm going to try to do is purchase offsets or credits so that way there's a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions somewhere else in the economy or in the country or in the world that can offset the greenhouse gas emissions that I'm doing so that I can net to zero. Scope 2 is really about managing your fuels. On the electricity side, this is a relatively mature market. There are lots of ways to interact with your utility. There are lots of ways to interact in the marketplace, depending on size, cost, and corporate goals. A lot of them have to do with, purchasing renewable energy credits or moving the next place and obtaining renewable energy credits through a virtual power purchase agreement, to owning your own renewable energy if you're a very large electric consumer. The Googles of the world have moved into that space, as well as, quite frankly, conserving energy, so energy efficiency. And especially when it comes to the use of gas and other items, that energy efficiency is a very good way to reduce your scope 2 organically rather than purchasing. Again, offsets can be used. Scope 3 is where, as Rhona mentioned, is where most of the action is. And that really requires intense interventions with what's going on in your business and your suppliers. The most effective way is to work with your suppliers to manage emissions within your value chain. Like I noted, scope 1, somebody's scope 1 reduction is likely your scope 3 reduction. So you can get it at the source. That's going to help manage your scope 3 inventory as well. There are other ways to do that. You can create requirements in your sourcing contracts. You can provide incentives for lower emissions inputs or lower emissions outputs. And you can purchase carbon products. There are some emerging on the marketplace today. And so it's really a question of how do you as an organization want to manage your scope 3 and what's actually possible based on what your value chain looks like.
So when we talk about carbon products, there's lots of vocabulary to learn. Zev was just finishing off on scope 3 inventory there, which I'll get to in a minute. But greenhouse gas inventory, that's going to be your inventory of all of your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions of a company. And those are mutually exclusive categories. They've specifically been set up by the standard so that they don't overlap with each other for the reporting company. The scope 3 inventory is the inventory of scope 3 emissions by a reporting company, as I've mentioned. And there's 3 key features when you're thinking about your scope 3 inventory. The first is that you have to establish a baseline of the company's scope 3 emissions. So you're creating a boundary that's involving your value chain activities, and your accountants will probably be involved in that. And then you set targets once you know what your boundary is and what your baseline is to try to achieve reductions in your inventory. And you track changes over time, and you track changes in your emissions over time. And finally, you report it out. The corporate standard and the scope 3 standard both require that greenhouse gas accounting and reporting of greenhouse gas inventory has to be based on these 5 principles: relevance, completeness, consistency, transparency, and accuracy. Relevance means that you have to ensure that your greenhouse gas inventory appropriately reflects the greenhouse gas emissions of the reporting company and serves the decision-making needs of internal and external users. Completeness means that you have to account for and report on all greenhouse gas emission sources and activities within that boundary that you set up of your value chain. And that means that if you're making any exclusions, you have to disclose them and be able to justify them. Consistency is a bit of a no-brainer. Obviously, if you keep moving the goalposts, whether your reporting is going to be your reporting is not going to be accurate, basically. So you have to consistently apply the same methodologies to allow for a meaningful performance tracking over time of your emissions. Transparency means you have to address all relevant issues in a factual and coherent manner, and they have to be auditable. And finally, accuracy means that you have to ensure that the quantification of the GHG emissions that you are reporting on are systematically neither over nor under your actual emissions as far as can be judged, and you have to minimize uncertainty to the extent possible. So one of the key items needed in order to set the baseline, set your targets, calculate your changes, and report is data. And data and the rights to data themselves are a product in the carbon market. When you measure scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, a reporting company is going to use their own data. They might use a consultant, but it's all stemming from their own operations. For scope 3 emissions, there's two different types of data that companies are permitted to use, and they are called primary data and secondary data. Primary data is the data from specific activities within the value chain. So you might have that data yourself from your own operations, that's within your value chain, but you also might request your suppliers within your value chain to provide you data so that you can do your own scope 3 inventory accounting and reporting. If you can't get primary data, and primary data is the higher quality data, if you can't get primary data, you can use secondary data. It's just not of the same quality, obviously. And secondary data is data not from specific activities within your value chain, but that it is available somewhere, whether it's industry average data, financial data, published data, proxy data, or some other type of generic data. So when you get this data, this typically involves some sort of licensing, and this is where the tech licensing lawyer comes out, because whether you're acting for the source or aggregator of the data, or you're acting for the company requiring data, you got to think outside the box. This is not your normal data license. If you act for the data licensor, you have to give the licensee sufficient data to be able to do what they need for their scope 3 inventory. But you also don't want to give up all rights to that data, because you might want to reuse it for other purposes, including other clients, especially if the value chains overlap with multiple companies in them. For the licensee, the data user in this case, you need to make sure you have enough rights to do what you need to do with your scope 3 inventory, to baseline it, to set your targets, to calculate your changes, and then ultimately to report as well.
So that's a lot to understand, but this slide really talks about how the vocabulary is evolving, and also just so that everybody can understand what we're talking about as we move forward. Offsets, credits, and insets are essentially the same underlying carbon product, but applied or essentially looked at in different ways. So the base product is an offset, which is some reduction or removal, some action taken somewhere in the world that lowers overall GHG emissions or removes GHG from the atmosphere. And the offset itself is title to that action. Now, oftentimes you hear carbon credits and those types of items, and a carbon credit is a type of offset. It is title to the action we discussed, but we generally use it as a title that is listed on one of the carbon registries. And therefore it's converted into a transferable, tradable instrument that's on a registry that sort of identifies who is owning title at that point in time to kind of keep track of this offset. An inset, again, is an offset. It is a action to either remove or reduce greenhouse gas emissions somewhere in the world, but the inset itself happens essentially somewhere within your value chain, either a geography in which you purchase product, or some kind of production, or something else from that perspective. But essentially it is an offset. It is title to the complete bundle of sticks related to this greenhouse gas reduction or removal from the atmosphere. It happens to just happen somewhere approximate to your value chain. And why is that important? Well, it's important because there are two types of accounting that we're going to have to go through to identify how you're doing or what are you reporting. The first is inventory accounting. So inventory accounting is just that. You take a look at your scope 1 emissions and you say they were this in 2020, they were this in 2021, they were this in 2022, and so on and so forth. You look at your scope 2 emissions. These are harder to quantify, but you essentially have that same inventory, and you do the same with your scope 3 emissions. And this is the need for primary data and secondary data and all of the kind of inventory that was going on. Now, the second type of accounting is intervention accounting. And interventions are specific actions to either reduce greenhouse gas emissions or to remove greenhouse gas from the atmosphere and sequester it somewhere. Intervention accounting is essentially an accounting of all the actions you have taken to reduce greenhouse gas in the world functionally. And what happens here is that if you're accounting for an intervention somewhere in your value chain, you're also reducing your scope 3 emissions, just like this intervention has reduced some entities' scope 1 emissions. But what's important here is that these are all global. Like I noted earlier, a scope 3 emission is a derivative of somebody's scope 1 emission. So taking care of interventions and identifying, quantifying, and measuring what specific actions have accomplished is essentially how you account for those reductions that you've caused versus the organic reductions that you're seeing when you do inventory accounting. What is a carbon product and what are its features? Well, as we noted, there are two kinds of accounting, intervention and inventory accounting. Generally, we like to think of carbon products as being derived from an intervention. Remember, an intervention can also be lack of action. And so what are the types of activities or the intervention that you're performing? Are you planting and preserving trees and therefore sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere? Are you changing agricultural practices, using cover crops to suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and sequester it in the ground, or changing your fertilizer application and therefore reducing your overall emissions? Are you distributing fuel efficient cook stoves? That's a wonderful example of, reducing on a per unit basis, but also seeing how the impacts to inventory accounting occur from that perspective as well. And are you capturing and destroying and or otherwise using landfill gas? These are examples of how you can generate different products. And again, the offset is titled to the entire bundle of sticks that are created by these actions. There are, one of the other items to think about is called retirement. And that's essentially if you buy these bundle of sticks as an offset, you retire them by taking them out of circulation so you can claim credit for purchasing them and also using them to offset your emissions. The calculation of carbon products is really a science-based question. If you're taking this kind of intervention and planting cover crops, the question is how do you measure the amount of carbon that's being sucked out of the air and sequestered in the ground? These are all science-based issues and science-based items using complex models, but different methodologies are used, and there's not one methodology that's ruled them all. Different products and different projects use different methodologies. Different registries recognize different methodologies, and some corporations recognize different methodologies. They tend to be industry and project specific. One of the key components of this is also additionality. You have to demonstrate that this offset would not have occurred, but for somebody taking action or quote unquote intervening. The notion of additionality is necessary because if you're offsetting your carbon emissions as a scope 1, then you have to show that this carbon reduction wouldn't have happened but for somebody doing something that they wouldn't have done any other way. And so that is a key piece to ensure that when you look at the use of a carbon product, that the carbon product is actually reducing overall greenhouse gases in the economy. Additionally, because these calculations are science-based, because they generally are done on a project basis, the old term trust but verify is necessary. And so therefore, while proponents of a project will go ahead and say, look at all the wonderful interventions we've done. We've set aside this this forest to sequester carbon. We've done no forest management except for thinning out dead trees so that new growth can come and increase the carbon reductions from the atmosphere. Generally, third-party entities are employed to go and verify that you are doing what you said you would do. And verification is a key part of certainly any registered carbon credit and also what the veracity of the claims can be. Now, with that said, verification can oftentimes be very expensive and be impractical. And there are many different ways to provide verification. Right now, sort of a lot of the carbon registries are requiring in-person verification or sample verification. But as technology evolves and as these methodologies evolve, this kind of verification can be done in many, many different ways. And then the last piece here is about permanence and reversals. If you're going to be offsetting your emissions because somebody has removed carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, well, it doesn't do anybody any good if that carbon dioxide is then released again into the atmosphere. You've just time shifted the same action that you're trying to avoid completely. There are many ways to manage through that, but generally some type of permanence of the carbon removal or reduction is necessary in order to have a valid or credible carbon offset. And also many times when carbon is removed from the atmosphere and sequestered somewhere, there is a buffer taken or insurance so that if, for example, there's a forest fire in a forest stand that's been reserved for carbon reduction, that forest fire will release carbon into the atmosphere, reversing a lot of what has already been taking place in the project. But we keep a buffer pool of credits to account for those kinds of items, and the size of the buffer pool is an actuarial exercise. That actuarial exercise is generally included in the methodology for the project. And then before I kick it over to Rhona, we'll bring up the last very important topic, which is you must avoid double counting.
So what is double counting? Well, one of the key components of any carbon product is to track the carbon dioxide equivalent reductions or removals so that you can't claim them twice. And this just makes sense. If the goal is to actually reduce the amount of emissions that are released into the atmosphere, if you have multiple companies claiming the same offset against their inventory of emissions, then we're not actually accomplishing the goal. And that's the concept of double counting. There are some rules around it though, so I'm just going to walk you through those rules. The first one is, as I mentioned before, scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 are mutually exclusive. They've been set up specifically. So when a reporting company reports their full GHG inventory, so scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, there's no double counting of emissions for that company, that reporting company. In the value chain, though, 2 or more companies may account for the same emission within scope 3. So let me give you an example. A dairy farmer has a cow that generates milk. The dairy farmer is taking the scope 1 emission. The milk is sold to the milk powder company. The milk powder company is in the value chain and they are taking the scope 3 emission. The milk powder company sells the milk powder to the chocolate powder company. The chocolate powder company can also take scope 3 emissions because they're all in the same, as long as they're in the same value chain. The chocolate powder company makes chocolate and sells it to the retailer that I mentioned earlier. The retailer is still in that same value chain. If they are, those have to be the facts, then they also can take scope 3 emissions. So now we have 3 companies, the milk powder company, the chocolate powder and eventually chocolate company, and the retailer, all making scope 3 claims on the same emissions. And that is still double counting, but it's an approved form of double counting that's allowed by the scope 3 standard, even though everyone in the value chain is proportionately taking the same scope 3 emission reductions. Of course, when you're doing this, you need to be transparent in your reporting. You need to be transparent that you're in the value chain and that you're working with partners to reduce the emissions. So on top of those 2 scenarios, and you've got the same 2 companies not able to claim the same offsets, you do have to avoid double counting between insets, offsets, and credits yourself and your scope 3 inventory. So you cannot both account for a reduction in your scope 3 inventory and then sell as a credit that same reduction. That is going to be double counting. When you're helping clients transact in carbon products, you should always be asking yourself, what double counting rules apply here and how can I get comfort around them in the transaction? Did you have anything else on that one?
No, I think that at the end of the day, what's important to recognize is when you're looking at the value chain, the scope 1 reduction at the farmer level essentially travels with the product through the value chain. So your scope 1 reduction results in scope 3 reductions. If you were to take that scope 1 reduction at the farmer level and sell it off, the entire bundle of sticks, to any entity or to put it on a registry to sell, that scope, the derivative scope 3 claims would essentially be eliminated. If you were to take the offset and make the scope 3 claims that are derivative of the scope 1 reduction, you would be double counting. And that's a material issue. And the guidance provides a lot of different ways to report offsets that you've created and sold versus reductions in your scope 1 emissions that then become derivative scope 3 claims through the value chain. And more products are being developed today to help manage through some of those double counting issues. At the end of the day, the entire ecosystem, as is currently provided by the GHG accounting protocols, all require everybody to essentially be transparent, because you have to rely on everybody else's reports in order to create your own. And that creates opportunity, that creates the ability to create new products, but it also creates real concerns about double counting.
Right. And risk on reliance on the report. So when your client's producing the report, you have to get them as accurate as possible, knowing that others are going to be relying on them downstream. Thank you. So carbon products can be registered or unregistered. And Zev mentioned earlier the different registries. There's an additional one, the gold standard, even though it says the good standard. That was one typo I forgot to change. It's actually the gold standard, as well as Vera Car and the Climate Action Reserve. So registered offsets are basically documented transactions. So it's an exchange of documents where the offsets are given a serial number, so that when they're retired, you're the only one that gets that number, and you have some comfort that no one else claims them. And so there's not two parties making a claim that they reduced their GHG emissions from the same source. Carbon offset registries track offset projects and methodologies that are used in the projects. They buy the carbon benefits from the sellers. They have different verification and validation procedures for the benefits, as I've mentioned. And then they issue the offset credits for each unit of emission of reduction or removal that's been verified and certified. And then ultimately, they are the source of truth for tracking the serial numbers for all the buyers of the offsets. And some of them also provide remedies where something goes wrong with the offset that you've purchased. So registries are basically creating a credible, fungible offset commodity. If you plan to sell on a registry, however, you might be shocked with the terms that they require, because they're still, even though they've been around for a few years, I would say in their infancy from a contractual point of view, and they are extremely demanding terms, which I hope over time become less demanding and more realistic for people who actually want to sell on those registries. Do you have anything else on?
No, the only thing I'd also say is this was very much what was going on in the renewable energy industry, 10, 15 years ago. And over time, the registries that were essentially voluntary and run by non-governmental organizations were recognized by different state laws and to be where registered credits have to be. The one thing that's significant with respect to the registries is the way they're structured, they only provide for offset products. You are taking the entire bundle of sticks to the carbon removal or reduction and placing it on the registry and selling it out of the value chain. Because of that, it's unclear if the registries will be the continued source of truth in the evolution of the industry, because they don't provide an opportunity yet. They may develop registered products from this perspective. They don't provide yet an opportunity to really manage through the value chain itself. And that's why
we have non-registered products. Great segue, thank you. So all is not lost. If you want to buy insets, there is a market for non-registered or unregistered carbon products too. And there's lots of different products that you can develop for sale this way. You just need a methodology and you need to understand the guidance and be transparent about what you're selling. And similar to registered products, these will be documentary transactions, if you like. Somebody has to be the source of truth for them. With the registry, they have it all tracked through serial numbers. If you are selling unregistered products or buying unregistered products, you need to understand how they're being tracked. They may or may not be verified. So you just need to be aware of what you're purchasing. And the key is that when you're selling them, you have to be transparent about what you're selling so that the buyer clearly understands what they're buying. And when you're the buyer, you need to clearly understand what you're buying so you know what you got and what you didn't get.
No, I think that's exactly right. And you'll see a common theme based on that for the remainder of the presentation. So if anybody wants to leave now, I'll just say buyer beware. You know, and it brings us really to the question. So how do these work? What's going on in this day and age? These are bilateral transactions, no matter who's performing the transaction or how the two parties got together. Today, they are true bilateral transactions. The registries don't work like a stock exchange. So because these are bilateral transactions, different products can be structured in different ways. There's title transfers like through offsets. There can be licensing to ensure that there's control and no double counting issues. And most importantly, the transaction itself must bring together some sort of exclusivity so that the product you're selling is not sold 6 times, or to be said differently, the bilateral transactions cannot be the sequel to the producers. And that's the play. A lot of these transactions happen through brokers. There are lots of entities in the marketplace today that go and help sponsor projects, get the projects registered, put the carbon products on the registry, and then go ahead and go find partners for bilateral transactions to sell credits. This is a common business model in the industry. It's a very successful business model in the industry. So if you're an entity that has a 14,000 acre stand of timber somewhere and you'd like to turn that into credits, there are entities out there that will help you set up that project, put it all together, and act as your broker. They generally have relationships with large entities who have scope 1 emissions that cannot be abated in any way, shape, or form, and who are looking to purchase offsets because that's what their business model demands. There are now evolving sales platforms. I'm not going to name any by name, but you can functionally buy carbon credits online now. If you want to do the right thing by the earth, that's a great opportunity to go do that for yourself personally. You can, if you're a smaller company, that may be another opportunity for you to do that as well. But those are now evolving. Futures and options, just like the CFTC wants to regulate these items, you know, you are starting to see futures and options develop here, which is essentially, for example, in the agriculture sector, paying a farmer to institute an intervention 3 years hence. Well, that's a future. That's like buying grain 3 years hence, and then you have a call option on the grain. So those things are developing, and folks are writing those kinds of financial contracts. This gets very complicated very quickly. And it's really important to know what you're buying, like Rhona said. And this isn't buyer beware because there's scams on the marketplace. This is buyer beware because your reporting is going to be affected by the types of products you're buying. And if you're creating products within your value chain, by the types of products you're selling or passing on to your customers. And that's why it's really important to understand what you're buying so that you know how to account for it in the appropriate way. So, again, like I said, this is the theme on the back end. These contracts and these products are generally governed by fraud and misrepresentations. That's the standard. Are you mislabeling what you're doing? Are you claiming that this product does something that it doesn't actually do based on how it's created and structured? The real answer is that the best way to solve for this is complete and total disclosure. This is the methodology we're using. These are the entities that have signed up. This is the geographical area. Here's my forest, and it was my father's forest. I inherited it, and I do plan to, it was last, felled for timber 35 years ago. We're still in the planting process, and we may do it again in 80 years. That kind of transparency is necessary so that as the buyer, you understand what you're buying and you can withstand any claims against you greenwashing, and as the seller to protect you from any misunderstanding as amongst the parties. And registered credits don't solve this problem. Now, registered credits have a third party essentially vouching for them. But as we've recently seen in the New York Times, there have been real questions about even the additionality of these kinds of credits, and other people calling into question, are these really offsets, or are they just forests that were never going to be felled for timber anyway? The other thing is the products continue to develop, and the development of these products is really intended to meet the inventory needs of entities up and down the value chain. Big box retailers are requiring reporting. All sorts of state laws may require, your gas service has to be offset with offsets. So products are continuing to develop to meet these very specific needs in the marketplace. And they evolve as the guidance evolves. Like I noted, we don't have any rules, we don't have any real governance, so we're relying on the guidance. And one of the big flaws of the guidance is they try to meet a perfect world, that everybody has perfect symmetry of information, that everybody's acting in the holistic best interest of the world. And then so there's a lot of gaps in the guidance, and there's not a lot of understanding about transactions and title and what does it really mean to own an offset, to create an offset, to own these intangible goods. Because of that, there's not standard purchase and sale terms. There is no market standard. There is no ISDA. There is no NASB. There is none of that floating around for these kinds of products. You work with different brokers, you'll get a different form. You work with different entities doing non-registered products, you'll get different contracts. In fact, if you work with the same entity buying different products, you may get very different contracts in and of themselves. So there's not a market standard yet, as everything tends to evolve. Similarly, there is no standardized product. And it's an interesting question if there ever will be one, given the vast diversity of all of the different kinds of industries and emissions that are really out there that we're trying to mitigate. So what does that really mean? Well, it means there are different products for different uses. Worth mentioning again, know what you're buying. And again, I just can't stress that enough. And so that also means know what you're buying the product for. Are you buying an offset? Are you buying the offset to satisfy a regulatory need? Are you buying the offset to satisfy some kind of unabatable scope 1 emission to meet your corporate goals? Are you buying the offset just in case? That's an interesting question. Are you buying something to reduce your scope 3 emissions? What does that really mean? How does that really work? What is the veracity of that product to meet your scope 3 issues? Where is there a scope 1 claim that you're being derivative from? What exactly is that product created to do? That goes along with, are you trying to make your value chain stronger? Like I noted, big box retailers are requiring reporting. They're trying to increase the carbon consciousness of their value chain by requiring that kind of reporting, and also to provide a value chain understanding and increase the inherent accuracy of their scope 3 inventory. I think one of the things that's important to note is, because the scope 3 inventories can be so vast, it's very hard with real accuracy to really know what your scope 3 inventory is. And the protocols and the guidance provide all different sorts of methodologies to find the proxy, that secondary data that Rhona was talking about. One of the carbon products here is just better data. Because you will see you can see a reduction in your overall scope 3 inventory if you're just calculating it more accurately. Are you just trying to make marketing claims? I mean, there is a world in which you want to report that your activities helped reduce X amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, or you sponsored these amounts of interventions, or for every camping stove you sell a low emissions, you give away a low emissions camping stove to a developing country. Those marketing claims require very different products than a registered carbon offset. And similarly, are you doing your sustainability reporting? Is this just part and parcel of how you're trying to get there? These products may be regulated out of existence. So what you're buying today may no longer be useful tomorrow. We just don't know. And so part of that is also to ensure you buy the seller so that you have some kind of reputable source of truth for what it is you're buying. So we're running out of time, so I'm going to run through these a little bit quickly. So best practices to follow. Well, this is going to be very unsatisfying, and it's going to be the general lawyer answer of it depends. Best practices vary. They generally tend to be industry specific because the industry itself that you're in really has very specific needs. Best practices evolve. Scope 2 emissions is really a place where best practices have evolved from just buying renewable energy credits to finding additionality of renewable energy on the grid you're being serviced on through VPPAs to buying your own stuff. Also, best practices evolve based on the size and nature of the entity you are. Best practices for a Fortune 100 company are likely to be different for a small mom and pop shop somewhere. It's a nascent market. And so again, best practices are going to evolve with the market. And there's no reason not to experiment and to see what kind of products you may want to use today. I want to say that you should be building expertise. This will affect everyone. We work with a lot of clients where this is non-core. There are consultants out there, but at the end of the day, this is likely to be a necessary support service for any organization doing whatever they're doing. You must understand your risks. What are your reporting risks? What are your, shareholder risks or other items like that? And then really the best practice is to watch our greenwashing webinar so you can understand what to say, what not to say, and what the real risks are with all of your reporting. So we have 2 minutes for questions. I don't see any in the chat. Looks like we got the timing right on the head. Rhona, what do you think?
Thank you very much for attending. It's a complex area, and I know we covered an awful lot of information today. Appreciate you sticking with us. And if you have questions offline, Zev and I are happy to answer them. Zev can probably answer them better.
I try, but Rhona will write you the better contract. So it really does take a team. Thank you, everybody, for showing up.